Good morning, everyone. We're going to give people a few moments to join and get settled before we start with Brandon Ballengee. Thank you for coming. We'll give people another minute or so, then we'll get started. Thank you. Brandon, are those your birds? Are those birds coming from your yard?
They are.
Yeah.
They are. And we have a lot of roosters in the yard at the moment too. So we'll probably.
I haven't heard one of those yet, but I'm hearing the birds and they're great. Okay, I think we'll get started. I'm seeing some folks in and no one has joined in the last few moments, so we'll go. Good morning, everyone. My name is Rebecca Strelick, and I am a distinguished professor of visual arts at Penn State Altoona and one of the team members of the S3A group. Thank you so much for joining this keynote session for the inaugural symposium. It's my pleasure to introduce Brandon Ballengee. Before I get into his introduction, a couple pieces of housekeeping. This is a webinar format, Zoom, in case you haven't been on one recently, where you can see us and some administrative assistants in the background as well, but we can't actually see you. We can see your names as participants. If you have questions at any point throughout the presentation, you can type them into the Q&A, which you can find at the bottom of the screen, or you can raise your hand, which I will be able to see and call on you, and even turn on your audio if you want to speak. Brandon is also going to ask for some questions at certain points throughout the presentation, but I will be keeping an eye on the time to make sure we do reserve some time at the end if you have questions for Brandon. I will do my very best to kind of triage your questions and group them if they're similar, and ask as many as I can in the time we have. We do have to end promptly at 10:45 Eastern so that we can move on to the next session. Brandon Ballengee, a recent recipient of a John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship, is a visual artist, biologist, and environmental educator based in Louisiana. Ballengee creates transdisciplinary artworks inspired from his ecological field and laboratory research. Since 1996, a central investigation focus has been the occurrence of developmental deformities and population declines among amphibians. In this presentation, Brandon will discuss how these and other works relate to the theme of care. Welcome, Brandon.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation, and it's a great honor to be here. Hopefully, can you hear me okay, everyone? Great. So this is really exciting, and the symposium looks great and at a very, very, very special moment in history. We just yesterday had the 51st anniversary of Earth Day, April 22nd, 1970. And I'll talk a little bit about this in the presentation. But think about how remarkable it is that we're meeting all over the United States, all over the world right now remotely, because we just had the 51st anniversary of Earth Day. We're in the middle of a global pandemic, and now we have the technology to still find ourselves together. I find it very, very remarkable. And I'll talk a little bit about COVID in a few minutes as well, and why I think it relates a lot to this necessity for what I would call eco-care. So I'm going to go ahead and start the slideshow, hopefully, and please let me know if we can't see. There we go. All right. So to begin, I'm calling this talk an art of eco-care, and I'm going to explain a little bit about what I mean by that. But just before going too deep into that idea, I want to just briefly talk about this term eco, which we see applied to all kinds of things now. I just saw there's an oil and gas company here in Louisiana that's calling themselves like eco something, like eco solutions, but it's a petrochemical company. So we see that this term is being used in lots and lots of different ways. But to go back to its origin for a second, ecology or eco was first coined by the artist and scientist Ernst Haeckel. Haeckel came up with a term derived from the ancient Greek word for home, or oikos. So really, when we talk about Haeckel in ecology, we're studying the home, right? So if you're not familiar with Haeckel's work, this is interesting. He published a book about landscapes. He did a whole book on landscape paintings that he did right at the turn of right around 1900. And if you're not familiar with his work, this is a great introduction. All of these plates are online. This is Art Forms in Nature. And this was published about 10 years after the landscape painting book. And Haeckel was, as I said, a scientist and an artist. And part of what his theories were is he could learn about these microorganisms and their evolution through these illustrations. And he had this really interesting idea of evolution, which turned out to be totally inaccurate. And he was dismissed from the scientific community because he kind of fudged his data through his drawings. But that's okay. The drawings are really, really beautiful. And I recommend definitely looking at them. The other thing I should say is, as far as eco-care and the environmental movement, the Art Forms in Nature book, for its time, it was the first time a popular science book had come out. It was large format lithographs, and it was a bestseller in Berlin for weeks. So definitely worth looking if you're not familiar with Haeckel's work. But interestingly, there's another term, ecology or oceology, which we really don't talk about very much, but Ellen Swallow Richards, who was the first woman to be admitted into MIT and go through MIT. She was a chemist and an engineer. She independently coined the term ecology or ecology, also from the word for home, and in a sense was a little closer to our definition of when we think of ecology today, because she was looking at, she said it was an interdisciplinary science that dealt with industry and water quality and these connections between human health and industrial growth. So she really saw it as like this whole systemic study, and she talked about it being interdisciplinary all the way back in 1892, which is remarkable when you think about the Industrial Revolution and the forward thinking that Ellen Swallow Richards had to even come up with this term. And so today, when we're talking about ecology, we're really talking about the branch of science that's concerned with relationships between organisms and their environment. And more often now, we're using the term eco to talk about conservation and really the care of ecosystems and specifically biodiversity. And as far as Earth Day and the environmental movement, this is, you think back to the first Earth Day. Well, the first Earth Day, which I didn't realize until last year when I was doing some research into this, was a response to the largest oil spill in US history, which happened off the coast of California, 1968. So 1969, the idea was politicians got together and they wanted to do something to promote the idea of the environment and ecosystems in the midst of this huge spill. So it was in Southern California. Then the first official Earth Day, they brought artists in. Actually, Bob Rauschenberg, or Robert Rauschenberg, was commissioned to create the first Earth Day poster. I think he made an edition of over 10,000 prints, which were then sold and donated. The funds were donated to an environmental conservation fund. And then you imagine just this moment in history. So 1969, 1970, and then in 1972, on the Apollo 17 mission, suddenly we have this photo, right? So this photo that really changes the world. We see ourselves all being on this little blue marble, right? This beautiful, living Earth. And then you think about Rachel Carlson and Silent Spring with the articles that came before. And that's where we find ourselves today in this really young environmental movement here in the United States. And you juxtapose that with where we're finding ourselves in. We're in the midst of this mass extinction event, where literally species are disappearing faster than we as biologists and scientists can even catalog them. So we're losing life and biodiversity at such a rapid rate. And I like to stop just for a second and think about this, not as being an artist or a scientist, but just being an individual human being alive at this really interesting moment. How do we respond to this extinction crisis? And then how do we, going back to the global pandemic for a second, when as a scientist or as a biologist, COVID-19 is considered an environmental disease. Like, it's a zoonotic disease that goes from one organism to another organism to humans. And it's considered representing environmental degradation. So there's a direct correlation between our lack of care for the environment and the response that's happened with this global pandemic. And so all these things are intertwined. And that's why I think it's so important that we start to think about how we can care. And just going to talk about this from my perspective. I am as an artist and a biologist, but I'm very, very interested in the way that I can utilize art and science to encourage youth and members of the public to get involved with citizen science and promote conservation and learning. And I'll talk about some of those practices. So for many years, since I was a kid, I've loved frogs and cold-blooded creatures. And unfortunately, one of the things that has happened is almost for every year that I've been on this planet, we've lost about 1% of the global amphibian population. And so that's something that is shocking and alarming. The photo on the left over here is a gastric brooding frog, a species of, there are two gastric brooding frogs. Both have gone extinct from Australia in my lifetime. So this was one of the last ones collected that I managed to photograph at the Museum of Natural History in Melbourne. And then this frog on the right, I mean, obviously something's going on with that frog, with supernumeric limb growth and these what are called malformations. So, or physical deformities. Amphibians are largely considered indicator species. The idea being that when you look at something like a bioindicator species, it teaches you something about the ecosystem health of a particular environment. In the case of amphibians, it was first thought that they were early indicators for environments that were disappearing, but later that was argued that it turns out amphibians are actually really resilient. So when we start to lose amphibians, we realize that there's a much more acute problem. So I don't want to go too far into the science, but I'd love to talk to you all about it later, or any chance to have a conversation about frogs. I'm more than happy to have with you. As a scientist, one of the things that I worked on is trying to sort out what could cause these deformities that we find increasing in frogs in North America, and what we found is a very complicated story. So frogs with supernumeric limbs or extra limbs often are caused by a type of parasite. And it's a mechanical process. It's fascinating, and I won't go in too deeply here, but what I will say is what we found is in agricultural landscapes, that is farm ponds or wetlands that are exposed to excess nutrients and pesticides, we find more deformed frogs and more of these parasites inhabiting. So it's a natural phenomenon, but something that's increased because of human activity. And the same, frogs with missing parts. We found that it turns out this crazy looking creature that looks like the monster from the movie Aliens is actually a dragonfly larvae. And through a series of studies, we found that in captivity, these dragonfly larvae would capture tadpoles, eat their little legs, and then let them go. So we found this whole range of deformities being caused from this injury from dragonfly larvae. And the same kind of thing, I ended up working on a larger study in Quebec, and we found that in agricultural ponds, there were more of these dragonfly larvae and less of a natural food chain. So again, increased by agriculture. So I guess this is some of the science side, and we can talk more about it at the end if there are any questions, but I wanted to talk about the art side. So as a scientist, when I'm doing this field and laboratory work, I have to stay very analytical. Even if I'm trying to inspire people to go out and catch frogs with me and do citizen science, an important part is to stay really focused and not let my concern or bias get in the way of the data. But as an artist, I'm allowed to create images like this. So this is kind of my response to the field and laboratory work and my concerns for the degradation of environments and my concern for the disappearance of amphibians. And so this is a portrait of one of the frogs that was found. This one's from California. It's been cleared and stained. It's not an X-ray. This is a chemical process. I do this chemistry to study development, but also because I'm so attracted to the aesthetic from an artistic standpoint. And then literally, this is a photograph specimen from a petri dish sitting in glycerin. So though it looks very celestial, which I really, really like, and it's actually because I'm lighting the specimen from underneath or from the sides when I take the photograph. So that's where the glowing comes from. And these are actually little pockets of air. But when printed, I use iris printing, which is watercolor ink on watercolor paper. So it has the feeling of, instead of this looking at it from the computer screen, when you see the finished work, it's got a very subdued palette, like a watercolor by Audubon, for example. And it's meant to be a reliquary. I only ever make one portrait per frog. I never addition them. It's really supposed to be this kind of connection to this one organism that had a very short-lived life. I should say that these deformities often are terminal. So when I'm at a field site with a group of kids or other scientists or citizen scientists, we find them and they're often dying. So I really try to capture their life somehow by wanting to generate this reliquary. The size in which they're printed is very important. They're printed roughly so that the frog is about the size of a human toddler, so that when you see it, the goal is to induce empathy, not fear or distance, but actually to see it in human terms in a way so that there's some kind of connection. And hopefully, my theory there is that, that kind of connection is the beginning for wanting to learn why this animal looks this way. The colors are seductive, and then you want to come closer and hopefully learn more about why this happened. And then from that, this whole process of how we can prevent it from happening. I should say that I mentioned that the causes for these deformities are basically agriculture, right? Or aspects of agriculture. I've worked with farmers on restoring wetlands, and found that in southern Quebec, one of the things that we could do is literally by creating uh, a, a if you will, a 10 meter or 3 meter, 10-foot section of plants, of unmowed plants around the ponds would absorb a lot of the agrochemicals. So what we would see is immediately the next year we had less deformed frogs, just because this little bit of field that filtered the water before going in. And what I found is once the farmers that I worked with in southern Quebec, they were really concerned that we were finding frogs like this. They love their frogs, which is great. And so working with them, they were really, it was a great chance to actually make a real world difference in a small way. And it wasn't expensive for them. It was just a matter of them not farming right next to the wetland. And when I'm doing this field work, as I said, I work with farmers and their families, but we call these eco actions. And really it's about doing the citizen science and making biology participatory, but it's also a way to just get people inspired and looking and connecting. We're living in this moment in history where we're considered an urban species. More than 51% of the human population lives within a greater urban area, and which is great in so many ways, and digital technology, which is so great, but we're having this real experiential gap. There's a wonderful book called Last Child in the Woods by Richard Loup that really diagnoses this nature deficit disorder that I think largely we as a population are everywhere all over the world are starting to experience more and more. And so literally one of the big underlying goals for doing these kind of participatory field trips is to get people connected again to non-human animals, to landscapes that they may be familiar with, but haven't really focused on. So it's a way to try to get people to connect and then find these organisms and then hopefully have an emotional response and want to care for them. So for me, that's one of the big sides for how you can connect humans to non-humans and then inspire conservation. And so this is a little introduction to the frog work, but I'm going to talk to you just for a second about another body of work called Love Motel for Insects. And this is an ongoing series that's been going for almost 20 years. And largely, we find ourselves in a similar situation. If it was thought for decades that although other species were disappearing, insects were okay because there's so many of them. We thought that somehow arthropods, because they're just such a mass volume, had really avoided this whole mass extinction. But it turns out recent studies have shown that even in protected areas in Germany and in nature parks and monarch butterflies, we're just seeing the same trends with population declines. So a big question is, what happens if insects disappear? When most people, when you talk even about what is an insect, the first thing that comes to mind are mosquitoes, bed bugs, flies, cockroaches, all those things that we detest. So most people, when you say that insects are disappearing, they're like, great. However, if we like chocolate, and we like, coffee, any number, upwards of 70% of our food sources somehow involve insect pollination or arthropod services. And without those arthropods, we would disappear. The estimate is Edward Wilson, E.O. Wilson, the retired entomologist and science conservation philosopher, says without insects, the rest of life in humanity would mostly disappear from the land within a few months. So they're really vital to the way ecosystems work, not only terrestrial, not only land ecosystems, but also aquatic ecosystems, because they're such an important food source. So one of the things that has inspired me about insects is just how diverse they are, and trying to think of ways that I could share that. And this really started as an experiment or an accident. In 2002, I was at La Selva Field Station in Costa Rica, in the at night, I went out with a ultraviolet light and some bed sheets from the field station, and I set up this moth watching station or bug watching station. And within a few minutes, there were just all these amazing bugs that came, like arthropods, mantids, and hemiptera, and moths, and it was wonderful. And the next night, I set it up again, but I invited my students, and I was co-teaching a neotropical art and evolution course with students from upstate New York from Hartwick College. And the students came and they were fascinated by all the insects. And then it just like a light bulb went on. I'm like, this is amazing. This is great public art because I'm able to use ultraviolet light, which attracts the insects. We think insects see a much higher spectrum of UV light than we do. So they're attracted. They're able to go, it doesn't harm them. And then people are fascinated by all this diversity. And I thought, this is great. I have to make this into public art. So I started literally doing that. So initially making these bigger experiments that were very minimal, like giant canvases, referencing minimalist art, but also the idea that the insects really would be attracted. And then we would have these nocturnal field trips to go bug watching. I've also done interventions into pre-existing spaces. So this is at a monastery in the Netherlands. So utilizing that space with all the monastery windows to make it glow in the dark, literally, and attract insects in an urban area. This is one from Delhi. This was a collaboration with architects from Chicago, referencing the national flower of India, the lotus. So you can see with this, people could actually sit in the middle of the sculpture. And then there were these pollinator gardens. So these pollinator gardens started to be more integrated into the design concept. So these are native hibiscus plants and carnations and other native plants to Delhi. And it kind of, in a sense, created this little miniature nature reserve inside of a very urbanized area. And then over time, the sculptures have become more and more inspired by the shapes of insects themselves. This is one based on a green darner wings, a dragonfly. This is one based on a swallowtail butterfly. This is a permanent one that's in Charlotte, and this is before the planting, but this is in a residential community, and this whole kind of area in the center is now a pollinator garden. So it's like this park that people can go to inside of the community to benefit insects, but also to create a green space. This is one from the Great Salt Lake. This is not permanent. It was there with the Salt Lake Institute, which was great to be able to bring, this is based on the wings of brine flies, to bring it out to Spiral Jetty with Robert Smithson's work to kind of have this dialogue. And this is one that's a permanent piece in the city of Joondalup, which is a suburb of Perth. You see these plants on the side. They're these slow growing arid plants to attract pollinators, but it's fascinating because pollinators in Australia are things like the emperor gum moth and insects, but there's also birds, but even small marsupials. Actually, they have these long whiskers and pollinate flowers. It's incredible. And this is one that just opened a couple weeks ago in Houston. So this is based on a monarch butterfly. And so I showed the slide of the monarch in the beginning, and it's twofold. To me, it's a symbol of what has been lost so rapidly, like monarch population. Some monarch populations have declined by over 90% in 20 years. However, in the past 5 years, some monarch populations have started to increase again because we're planting. Because there's so many of us that are out planting milkweed and trying to restore habitats, and it works. It happens fast. Like already, like I'll explain in a little while. Where we're at, we have lots of pollinator habitat on our land, and this is shaped after a monarch that literally was grown here at our little farm, at our little nature reserve. So hopefully, it's a symbol of both, like. The idea that we have to be concerned about the declines, but also a symbol of hope because conservation works. And going along with all these, the Love Motel for insects are what I call trans species happenings. So these are bug boot camp because the kids all wear boots. I invite in other artists and scientists and musicians, and we have these bug stock and trans species happening. So there'll be music and food and all kinds of things. People can adopt mealworms if they want to, making bug nets, and often doing these plantings, finding a location where we can create a pollinator garden. This is one pollinator garden being created in Laramie, Wyoming. But it's also just this way, again, of connecting people to a side of nature that they often don't pay attention to, but a side of nature that is just so remarkably important. That's so essential for our survival. And just look at the diversity of these shapes and colors and forms. I'm making a permanent work for Ballengee State Park in Louisiana now. And I went and set up lights, and this was 3 hours, 3 hours of insect watching. And this is just a fraction of the diversity that was there. It's incredible. And just to think about them, not only in terms of ecosystem services, what they're doing for ecosystems, but just them as individual, interesting life forms. I mean, look at the diversity, the aesthetic of the shapes and the colors and forms. It's really, really incredible. So I encourage you all to come join me and go bug watching at some point, or bug watch in your backyard. And I'm going to switch over to the next project. So as some of you all may recall, we had a little oil spill in Louisiana in 2010. Well, it turns out it's the largest oil spill in history. The spill in Southern California in 1969, at that point, was the largest. Then there was Exxon Valdez, then Deepwater Horizon. Well, before that, the Taylor energy spill, which is ongoing. It's never been fixed. I'll talk about it in a few minutes, but then we have the Deepwater Horizon spill. And it's remarkable the amount of oil that is spilled into the Gulf of Mexico. And it's considered the largest spill in global history, as far as we know. Over 200 million gallons. This is kind of the impact from April through July of 2010, just to see how widespread it was. Now imagine that these are satellite images from July, but it continued all the way up into Panacea, into the Panhandle, and arguably oil was found along the Atlantic coast, and oil also somewhere over here. And so the idea is, now that we're 11 years out, we'll be on the 11th anniversary on April 25th, that oil has disappeared. Well, the reality is we only were able to sequester, to clean up about half of it. That's the guesstimate. We don't know where a lot of the oil is now. It remains in the Gulf. It was mixed with chemical dispersants, which actually made the oil much more toxic, 52% more toxic, at least from laboratory studies. So as it was mixing, one of the things that really concerned us was, what impact does this have on the food chain? The Gulf of Mexico, just look at it. It is the Northern Caribbean. Louisiana is a Caribbean state, in my opinion, at least South Louisiana. This is one of the most biodiverse, saltwater habitats on the planet. There's just thousands and thousands of species that utilize this as a nursery. So it was really a problematic area in so many ways for an oil spill to happen. So many people in South Louisiana rely on seafood as an essential source of food, of protein. And then likewise, most of the shrimp and crabs that are sold in the United States are coming from this area. Even if you're in Cape Cod, you're more than likely getting crabs from the Gulf of Mexico. So anyway, one of the things that really worried us is what happens when this mixes in to the food chain. And so, not a scientist, but I worked with other scientists to kind of speculate what this would do to the food chain. So this is the oil itself. These are the chemical dispersants that's used to, what the dispersants do is instead of making the oil, they break the oil up molecularly. Oil is big and fatty, so it floats. And then when you use these dispersants, they molecularly break this up and they make the little molecules sink instead of floating. So the good side to that is in a small spill, it's not beaching the shoreline, it's sinking to a place where you can then, essentially vacuum it up. In the case of Deepwater Horizon, it's so much oil mixed with this material, and now it meant that it was more widespread. So several other biologists and I wanted to respond. So we created this installation called Collapse. And so it's literally over 26,000 preserved specimens. It was shown in New York in 2012 for the first time and has been traveling since then. And you imagine it represents about 370 different species, which is less than 3% of the known species in the Gulf of Mexico. So if we had another 97 of these, it would be closer to just what we know. But we know more about the surface of the moon than we know about the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. So it's still this ecosystem that we're still learning so much about. We described it. There was a new whale, a giant whale that was described just a few weeks ago in the Gulf of Mexico. So there's so many things that we don't know. And so the hope with this piece was it was a sculptural response to these concerns for the impact from the spill. The idea was it was not a scientific display. It wasn't didactic. There were labels and a guide that you could follow to learn what all the species were. But the idea wasn't that you would be able to see everything. It was all about the complexity and the mystery and the beauty of these forms. And you see, what I tried to do is I went through each jar and either individually hand stitched the specimens to pieces of glass so that they could be seen, or presented them in a way so it was really about the aesthetic and making something beautiful and mysterious and making us think, like bringing us back to the reality that we don't know the impact of the spill. And so this was a shrimp that was being sold in one of the markets in 2012. You can see it still had oil staining. So it was a bit about that too, like how far does this reach out into not only biodiversity but human populations. So Collapse was one response, and then as a result, a few years later, I ended up moving to Louisiana. I just found Louisiana and the people here and the ecosystem so important. I wanted to more or less try to be at the front line of all these changes that are happening. I mean, we're losing land in Louisiana faster than any other place on the planet. And so I joined a team at LSU as a postdoc in the fish lab. Even though I'm a frog guy, I'm now doing fish work. And one of the first things that we wanted to do is just look at what species of fishes, endemic fishes. Endemics are fish that are found, like an endemic species is a species that's found one place and nowhere else on the planet. And so we did a study to look at the 77 endemic species of the Gulf. There's arguably 77 to around 87. And what we found is since 2010, there were 14 missing species. So literally, as the citizen science component, I created these wanted posters and put them, in coastal marinas and schools, and tried to work with shrimpers and fishermen, and did all these citizen science projects to try to find some of these missing species. And we found one, which is pretty exciting. So we found one of the missing killifish, which was really great. And so this project continues. That's actually what I'm continuing as a Guggenheim Fellow now, is searching for these ghosts of the Gulf. And what we found is out of those 77 endemics, there are several that were reported once, collected and found once, maybe in a shrimp net or washed ashore, and never seen again. So we know virtually nothing about them or whether they're still in the Gulf of Mexico. And then there's another 20 or 30 that just for whatever reason haven't been seen or reported in decades. So the thing is, what I'm trying to do now is literally continue this idea of going out with teams, organizing these citizen science field trips, showing up in strange and unusual places to meet people, like the blessing of the fleet. This is when the shrimp boats start for the season. A priest goes out at the beginning and they bless all of the ships as they pass through, and everybody goes out shrimping. And then it's an amazing cultural experience. And this is in Pointe-aux-Chenes, South Louisiana. This is a Native American community. And then also working is artist in residence at the Sitka's fish collection, which is the second largest fish collection on the planet, which is located in Ballengee, Louisiana, in Plaquemines Parish. So it's the Smithsonian has the largest pickled fish collection on the planet. Tulane has the second largest. They're only the Smithsonian only has a few thousand more specimens, which is pretty remarkable. So working in and trying to sort out how we can do some programming in the fish collection, bringing school groups in and other groups, and looking at the way maybe this could be a form of ecotourism. And then creating these portraits of some of the missing species. So these are x-rays. These are from a residency I did at the Smithsonian. And so I'm working on trying to think of how to transform these x-rays into either pirate flags. That's what I'm doing that right now. I'm actually trying to rethink this idea of the pirate flag. It's a long story, but there's a pirate that's famous in Louisiana called Jean Lafitte. Jean Lafitte, to the Native American population here and to some of the other populations, is considered a cultural hero. He helped the Native Americans. He helped broker good deals with the French and the Spanish. So often you'll see pirate flags at the blessing of the fleet. And I was thinking about rethinking some of these pirate flags with these missing species. So working on that. This is a Fringe lantern shark. This is one that disappeared since the oil spill. But then also creating these portraits of hand-painted portraits, which I'll talk about in the studio visit a bit more. But these are actually made from crude oil from Deepwater Horizon, as well as the Taylor energy spill, which is the Taylor energy spill. If you haven't heard of it, please try to Google it and learn more. It's outrageous. It's an oil spill that's been going for more than a decade, and there's no effort to try to stop it because there's no litigation in process to try to stop it. It's a slow leak. It still probably has not leaked as much as the Deepwater Horizon, but it's ongoing, and there's no effort to try to, and there's no media covering the spill. Anyway, so this is using some of the Taylor oil and some of the chemical dispersants actually to make oil paintings. And I'm also working on a portable version of Collapse that I'll bring to festivals like the Blessing of the Fleet and schools and marinas, and just kind of pull this up to a library and meet and greet people and talk to them about biodiversity. And then if any of you all happen to have an extra boat, I'd be happy to take it off of your hands. I mean, I think it would be great. I'd love to try to, at some point in the long term, get a boat and outfit it as a portable lab and classroom and be able to go out and look for these fishes together. So that's the last kind of art science project I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about one other thing. But before I do that, I want to just pose this question. We're talking about eco-care, and a big part of caring for me is about biodiversity, like trying to, I think I'm what E.O. Wilson would say, I'm a biophiliac. I want to be connected to nature. I have a innate love for animals and other species. And I'm always asking this question of myself and others, like, who can save biodiversity? And I think that the response is it's every single one of us. You know, every day of our lives, we're making choices. We're voting every time we go to the grocery store, right? Where the food that we consume, how we're transporting ourselves different places, what we're doing in our backyard or not doing, the chemicals that we're using, what we're choosing to plant or not plant, or if you're living in an apartment, what you can do on your rooftop, or when we were in Brooklyn, we had a pollinator garden, like literally on our fire escape. So there's so many different creative possibilities. And often we think that, I think most of us feel like overwhelmed, like we can't do anything, but it's not true. We all have the ability to do something positive for biodiversity and ecosystems, which in turn helps ourselves every day. We can do something small, which all have an impact. And or you can do other crazy things. So I'm going to tell you about our crazy project. So literally what we wanted to do, my wife and at that point our 4-year-old son, we left New York City and we moved to rural South Louisiana. We bought a little tiny house with 9 acres of soy fields. So imagine our little houses up here with various like buildings that are all falling apart. And so this was all soy. So we began immediately by taking those soy fields out and putting in these kind of habitats. So it was about 9 acres. And instantly what we saw is, this is Victor, this is the little boy, our son. Now there's a little girl too named Lily. And so Victor and we brought in the Cub Scouts and community, kids of all ages and volunteers. We planted over 1,300 baby trees, and we've got about 3 acres of prairie grass. And the idea was to kind of renature this agricultural farmland. Typically what happens is you have natural area, it becomes agricultural, and then it becomes suburban or urban. Usually old farmland is transformed into housing, right? Subdivisions. So the question is, what happens if we do the other? What if we renature it? And what we found is, along the way is doing research, those prairie grasses, we've been increasingly getting involved with the idea of carbon sequestering. So utilizing prairie grasses to suck carbon out of the atmosphere and back into the ground. And then we've, largely through the help of patrons and supporters, we were able to buy another 16 acres next door. So we're at about 25 acres now. And what we've seen is, just since we've been replanting, this incredible amount of biodiversity that has come back. Not just monarchs, but all kinds of migratory birds and a little alligator and armadillos, and all kinds of things. And last Halloween, we did a bio blitz where we recorded over 200 species, which is incredible to think that this was just a GMO monoculture field a few years ago. Another thing that we're trying to do is, Louisiana has some of the worst science education, rural Louisiana especially, science education in the US, as well as art education. So we're trying to do a lot of art science programming, free programming, and other programs for youth groups and community members. We also do a Halloween festival. Hopefully we didn't do it last year because of COVID, but this year we're going to do it October 30th. So please come down, plan on coming to visit our great Halloween festival, where there's all kinds of things going on. And here's a little bit, we're also working with local artists and inviting artists to come in and build ephemeral sculptures. So we'll show you one in one of the videos here in a minute to get an idea of what the long-term plan is for the atelier. We're calling it Atelier de la Nature, which basically means nature's workshop. And we're actually in the French-speaking part of Louisiana, where about 40% of people still speak French at home. So that's it for the slideshow. I do have the video to show for the studio visit. I realize I kind of went over on time, but I guess are there any questions to start with before showing a video?
I see Michaela. I'll let her talk. You're unmuted. Michaela. Sorry if I'm messing up your name. You can speak. Hearing
Yeah,
her.
yeah. So not able to hear.
Do you want to type your question into the Q&A and I can read it? I'm not sure.
Alternatively, if you're having technological ones, you can always email a question to me.
Yeah. I'm not seeing any other questions show up in the Q&A. Brandon, we have about 9 minutes if you want to show 1 or 2 of the videos, depending on the length.
Sure. Why don't I, I'll show you a few minutes of this and then we can.
Okay.
Ran over. Okay, let's see. So this is the studio.
Oh, I'm still seeing PowerPoint.
Oh, you are, okay.
I think you have to unshare that and then.
Okay, let's see. Did that stop it?
Yeah, you're not sharing anything right now.
Okay. Now, can you see anything?
Not yet.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Let's see. There we go. Okay.
Got it.
Okay. Hello, welcome to my studio. Come on over, I want to show you some of the projects. So, first of all, this space, my family and I moved into about 5 years ago. This is one of several buildings that we've been trying to fix up and restore. It's what's called an outdoor kitchen in Louisiana terms. So it's a little structure behind the main house. And we've just been using it as a studio space, a little bit of a library, a little bit of a classroom. And I brought some works to show you. You can see we've got specimens here too. So there's preserved specimens, a little natural history collection, lots and lots of different art projects going on. We recently had a retired biologist donate a collection of natural history artifacts to the Atelier de la Nature. And so we're working on trying to figure out how to catalog those and where those are going to go. And I want to show you a body of work that I've been working on for a little over a year. Actually, I've been experimenting with since 2010, since the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And it's part of the project has been researching and looking at missing species of endemic fishes in the Gulf of Mexico following the spill, as well as researching and learning about species that disappeared even prior to the spill. So one of the but also it's fascinating because it's sitting on these enormous oil reserves. So just naturally all the time, there are all these seeps of oil that are coming up and bacteria that have adapted and microorganisms that have adapted to not only live with that oil, but actually consume that oil. So all of that is really fascinating. It's incredibly dynamic, but as human beings with a fascination for a hunger for energy, we've really caused quite a bit of damage to the Gulf by extracting that oil and trying to use it as a petrochemical resource. And so there's no way to know if these species disappeared as a result of the oil and gas industry, but I wanted to somehow show that relationship. Even if oil and gas was not involved, I wanted to create these portraits out of oil because these organisms live in the Gulf where oil is such a prominent part of the environment. So literally what I've done is through years and years of experimentation, you can kind of see here some of the process. I'm utilizing oil from the Deepwater Horizon oil spill as paint, basically. I'm utilizing sediment mixed with oil from the oils from Deepwater Horizon oil spill. I'm mixing it with Corexit, these chemical dispersants. So it's almost like I'm able to treat it like an oil painting where you're mixing it with different material to thin out the oil. I'm also collaborating with a team that's collecting oil from an ongoing spill called the Taylor spill, which I'll talk about in my talk. And then just literally trying to figure out a way to control that material and make these portraits. So that's a little bit of the test. And you can kind of see with some of these specimens, I'm actually drawing and painting from preserved specimens. In the case of the missing species, I'm mostly working with photographs that I've taken of specimens in natural history collections. So at the Smithsonian in Washington, DC, as well as other specimens from University of Florida, and then Tulane University, and photographing them and x-raying them, and then translating those depictions into these portraits, into these what I call oil paintings. So you can see this is one of the earlier ones, one of the earlier experiments. And you see it's taken a lot of time to sort out how to control this material. Because what will happen, what I learned is I would paint with it and I would have this beautiful finished portrait, and I would come back 2 days later and the oil continued to move. So it's really like this kind of push and pull between learning how to work with the material, creating a finished portrait, but also being open to the fact that there's a chemical experiment happening. These have been sitting for months. Normally, I would not be working with these in this space. I let them dry for months, so literally all the hydrocarbons and all of the toxic material that's released from this oil is no longer in the air, so it's not a danger. Essentially what happens is over time they do dry, and they end up being like the equivalent to like tar. But when I'm working on them, I actually have another outdoor space, which is an old garage with good ventilation, but I still use a serious respirator because the material itself is so incredibly toxic and carcinogenic. I want to protect myself and also let them sit outside and cure so that I'm when these are eventually shown, I'm not harming viewers either. So the first one we saw, this is another experiment. This one is mixing in sediment. So it's anaerobic bacteria, which is this kind of blackish color mixed with Deepwater Horizon oil from Barataria Bay. That's in Plaquemines Parish, south of New Orleans, which was a heavily impacted area from the 2010 spill. Okay, I'm just gonna, because I just talk a little bit more, I realize we're running out of time. I'll show you one other little section here, which is the other part of the studio, if you will. All right, we're going till 10:45, so we have 15 minutes. Okay.
Correct.
Good. Well, this is just a minute 30, and then there's another short video if we want to try, or if there's any other questions. Okay. Hello again. I thought it would be nice if we came out to one of the wetlands here at the atelier that we are working on, as far as the idea of a studio visit, because so much of this land is really, one, a living artwork, but always an inspiration for programs and my own art and art that I'm working with communities. And I just wanted to show you this thriving wetland because it's only a little over a year old. Imagine 5 years ago, this wetland would have been a soybean field, a GMO pesticide-ridden soybean field. And now, I don't know if you can see the water, it's just teeming with thousands of little creatures, all kinds of native fish. We planted it with more than 30 native species. And guys, what kind of animals live here in the pond?
Turtles.
Turtles. What else? And tadpoles. That's right. All kinds of different critters. We've had, I think, 3 species of snakes so far. And anyway, I wanted to share a little bit of just how beautiful this landscape is and how it's really, oh, look at the hawk, guys. Okay, well, thank you all very much. Okay, good, all right. We did have the Weather Channel came out about 2 months ago, and then they just showed this yesterday. I don't know if we want to watch that. Are there any questions before or anything?
There are a couple comments in the Q&A, Brandon, if you want to check those out. Otherwise, I don't see any direct questions. Does anyone have any questions for Brandon? You can continue with the Weather Channel video, I think.
Okay, so let's see. Can you see it?
I'm not seeing it yet. I'm
Okay.
still seeing the end of the studio tour.
Okay, let's see.
Ah, there we are.
There we go. Okay. All right, here we go.
Combining art with science is a great way to get people inspired about the nature in our backyards. My name is Brandon Ballengee, and I'd like to invite you to the Atelier de la Nature. Here, my family and I have taken old farmland and we're making it into a nature reserve and eco campus. What we've done is we've transformed old farmland back into a nature reserve to create habitat for wild animals and all kinds of biodiversity. Additionally, we have our own little family farm with lots of animals. And then we also, in our eco campus, have created a sculpture garden where we invite artists and scientists to come and create works of art like this. This work of art actually functions as a habitat for bumblebees and other insects. I think one of the big goals is to try to get people from different backgrounds talking together, whether they're scientists or whether they're artists, but just communicating. And then I think to solve these complicated socio-ecological issues, we need that creativity from many different sides. I think many of us feel discouraged and overwhelmed by issues like species extinction, climate change. However, we're contributing to those changes, whether we're aware of it or not, and we can have positive pushback against that. Our global food production relies on pollination or other services performed by bugs. One of the most common misconceptions across the board is that you as an individual cannot make a difference. That's an absolute lie. We absolutely can make a difference. We make differences every day, whether we're conscious of it or not. So this is another one of the works here in the sculpture park. This one is really interesting. We're trying to use recycled materials. So working with some of the local bicycling groups and some of the shops locally, we've been trying to reuse materials. And the idea here is to use it to create an archway. If we focus too much on the negative, we're going to lose chance to even save what's still around us. And we can save those things. Life wants to persist. We know it, and we need to infect that into our politicians. We need to infect that into our businesses. We need to infect that into our lifestyles. And we can do it. Of course, there's going to be bumps in the road. Of course, there's going to be challenges. But that's exactly what human beings are good at. We're actually really good at working together. That's how we got here in the first place.
Thank you for sharing those. We do have a question. What do you think of Ruth Ozecki's work and discussion of farms and petrochemical endocrine disruptors to human bodies and the extreme distortions that result?
Well, excellent question. Well, I recommend if you have an opportunity from we're talking about endocrine disruptors and some of the malformations in amphibians, which is the area that I know more. There's a fascinating story in the New Yorker about a scientist named Tyrone Hayes. Please try to find it. It's a great example of a scientist who discovered the way that pesticides were causing sexual deformities in wild populations of frogs all over the United States. And he was literally attacked and demonized. They personally, the the petrochemical industry, or not petrochemical, the pesticide industry went after him and his family and tried to discredit him as a scientist. And it's an amazing story. So yes, it's something, from our land too, something that we're trying to sort out. How do we work through these kind of complicated pollutants? And one of the first things that we did is to try to plant plants that were bioaccumulating. I don't know if you're familiar with this artwork or not, but Mel Chin, working with Dr. Rufus Cheney, did this piece called Revival Field I think in the I can't remember the year now, but more than 25 years ago. And what they were doing is they were doing phytoremediation, so utilizing plants to literally suck toxins out of the soil. So Mel's work became, like, one, an inspiration, but two, the science behind phytoremediation really exploded after that artwork. It was a chance, it was a USDA scientist who couldn't find funding for his work to do an outdoor experiment, and Mel got I think a $10,000 NEA grant, which led to this outdoor experiment where they were leaching toxins out of the soil using plants, which now led to this multi-billion-dollar industry of phyto plant remediation. So we were trying to do that. How effective it was, I don't know. All I can say is we, from the study so far, the fish and the amphibians, and except for one Luna moth with a distorted wing, we've only had, the animals superficially look very healthy in the ecosystems that have been recreated. Okay.
Any other questions? We have just a couple more minutes, Brandon. I wanted to ask you, I've written it down 4 times now because it's resonated with me, and that is this idea of specimen as aesthetic. Because I think sometimes in order to get to the general public with maybe things they don't want to hear or aren't ready to hear, art often becomes that gateway, right? As you were saying. So this idea of, I think most people assume when they see your prints, the watercolor prints, that those are generated, that's computer graphics, like you're actually making those images. And those are specimen, right? And I guess, could you just talk a little bit about your experience with the public when they have that reckoning, like that it's real, right? The scale, the toddler scale, I'm sure you've seen it in real time several times now when they realize what they're actually looking at. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the sides of this work that is really complicated. They seem so surreal, but then you're confronted by the fact that this is actually a very detailed depiction of our reality now. And that's, I think, when people see that, often their response is emotive, and emotional, which I think is so important. I mean, when was the last time you saw someone cry at a contemporary art exhibition? And I think it's okay. We need to cry. We need to come to terms with the damage that we're causing so that we can start to heal, like individually, and try to heal ecosystems. So I very much hope that people have the emotional response that I have, and that the groups of people that I have, when we're out collecting together, I mean, it's hard, or it can be, but sometimes it's just super inspirational. We just find like healthy ecosystems and healthy organisms, and it's great. One thing I would say too, which I didn't have time to talk about in the talk, but there's the print, and there's another sculptural installation called Styx, named after the river Styx, and it's a large black monolith, like dark charcoal gray monolith, and it's basically a light box, and I've got 13 of those cleared and stained specimens in it. So the lights literally are coming from underneath the specimen, and they look like gems. I mean, it's really unreal. I mean, the frogs themselves are really quite small, but when given the opportunity, I like to show the two in proximity to each other, the sculptural work and the prints, so that you have this kind of human connection, but then you also have this very individual connection, because the specimens are in these small dishes where light is coming through, and you have to have this very intimate experience of looking at that individual specimen and realizing that it's real and that I think it hopefully it wakes people up in a sense, or makes them more aware.
We have a comment from one of our attendees that says, "Thank you for a fascinating and engaging talk and presentation, and look forward to digging deeper into your practice. Cheers." I can't think of a more poignant way to thank you for your time, Brandon. I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation, as I think many of our attendees did as well, based on their reactions and the things that they're talking about. So thank you so much for being a part of this.
And I hope you all will seriously come visit us, come down for the Halloween Festival. It's October 30th. And if you're an artist and you're interested in perhaps doing something with the community here, or creating an ephemeral artwork, or please be in touch. It'd be great. Love to discuss it with you. So thank you
you
very
so
much.
much, Brandon. Thank you. Thank you all for coming, and hope to see you at the rest of the presentations throughout today and tomorrow.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Alex has to.